All right, so we have here red osier dogwood, the Cornus stolonifera, and it has a beautiful small flower initially. And then it has the white berries that come later. By the way, these white berries are an exceptional, you'll see how they squirt. So you can notice that this particular berry, when you squeeze it, you get a really immense amount of a very soothing, very slippery kind of water that is the best hair conditioner in the world. You have to try it to believe me. And then you can always take huge amounts in the fall and squeeze out the juice and ice cube it, and then you'll have lots of it for the winter time. This was taught to me by a student of mine whose grandmother was a Cree healer. You can't buy anything as good. The plant itself has a number of uses. The bark and the leaves both contain cornine, which is a very interesting compound that is helpful for relieving anti-inflammatory conditions, anodyne, antipyretic, for those who are allergic to salicylates. That is, if you can't use willow bark or you can't use poplar bark for chronic arthritic conditions, you may find that the bark or leaf of this as a decoction or an infusion is very, very useful for relieving those kinds of symptoms. You can never mistake this plant for anything else in this part of the forest, because when you take the leaf, it has a little latex in the leaf. And like its cousin bunchberry, when you do it, you'll notice that it has a latex that holds the leaf together. And it's the only plant in this part of the world that has that kind of quality. Now, interestingly, people in the native people, First Nations of this part of the world, particularly the Cree in northern Alberta, would take the stems of this plant, feather them, put them by a fire, and then as they curled back, they would remove the inner bark and put that into their smoking mixtures, which they called kinnikinnick. Now, kinnikinnick is actually a smoking mixture, not a specific herb. And they would take blends and make blends. Now, they would often take and combine this with another plant to create a relief from different kinds of conditions, inflammatory, moods, etc., swellings, rheumatism, headaches, etc. So the smoking mixtures often were medicinal in nature. Early ethnobotanists were very crude in their analysis of this, and they would often give disparaging remarks like, oh, the poor natives, when they run out of tobacco, they often dry whatever plant material, twigs and leaves are around to smoke them. But I assure you they knew exactly what they were doing. The Cree also would take the stem of this particular plant, which can be quite large. They'd usually get a stick about 18 inches long, something the diameter of my thumb, a little bigger. And they would go to the gall of goldenrod. Goldenrod stems often will have an insect gall about halfway or 2/3 up the stem. They would remove that little insect, stick it into the end of the red osier dogwood branch, and it would have no choice but to crawl out the other end. Take a couple of months, and then they would have a perfect pipe stem for smoking their kinnikinnick mixture. This is fireweed in its later stages. The flowers are just starting to fade and go into the pods. This used to be called Epilobium angustifolium. They've changed it now. It's Chimerion angustifolium. Fireweed, the name fireweed connotates that it actually moves into areas of destruction, either nature, landslides, etc., fires. In fact, it was the first plant to come back on Mount St. Helens after the eruption. It was one of the first introductory plants. Fireweed has a number of great uses. The flower itself is a rich source of nectar, and in fact, fireweed honey is the preferred confectionery honey by bakers and people who make desserts. It's the finest honey for that kind of purpose. The flowers themselves, absolutely, when you taste them, you can taste the sweetness of the flower. The plant itself, particularly the leaves, and to a lesser extent the root, the leaves are very, very useful as a infusion for people who suffer candidiasis or who have ileocecal valve incompetence associated with intestinal dysbiosis and the wrong kind of bacteria growing in the large intestine. The leaf is also the most important, or one of the most important, along with nettle, stinging nettle root, for maintaining health and integrity of the prostate. That is, it will help to prevent enlargement or benign prostatic hyperplasia or hypertrophy of the prostate, as well as some clinical trials of recent origins suggest that it may be useful for the early treatment of prostate cancers. So this particular leaf, very, very useful. It contains compounds that my good survivalist friend Morris Kochanski says activate other herbs that it is put with and maybe increase their efficacy up to 7 times. And I have noticed with some herbal formulas that that may be true. In fact, the early Kamchatka ales that were produced in Siberia with Amanita muscaria, the great fly agaric, they would take the dried fruiting bodies of that particular mushroom, combine it with the stems that are rich in sugar of fireweed, the stems of cow parsnip, Heraculum lanatum, which are also very rich in sugars. In fact, were used for years as part of beers in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and unripe blueberry, the Vaccinium uglanosum, the green fruited interior, like the green on the inside, blue on the outside, that particular berry in the unripe stage, those 4 were fermented into an ale that was very, very powerful, hallucinogenic, and used for shamanic journeys and seance and stuff of that nature. That particular formula is something that is being reintroduced by people today. The fireweed itself, the other things that is interesting, it has one of the few fibers from the wilderness that is, and you can see the fluff. If I could just get you a little bit of fluff here. You'll notice this is the fluff that comes from the fireweed pod, and you'll notice how soft and very light it is. And natives of this part of the world and into British Columbia used to combine this particular very waterproof fiber with dog hair or mountain goat hair and make waterproof blankets and other things for themselves. They wove it together. And you can see that it really lends itself to actually spinning. The other thing it's really good for is it's one of the few wilderness wicks that doesn't carbonize. That is, if I took this wick, put it into some fat, lit it, it would burn endlessly through the night and would not burn up. So it's a good wick to know about if you are ever caught in the woods without all the amenities. So fireweed, a very, very valuable plant, has some other minor uses. Its astringency can be very useful for some respiratory problems, for intestinal issues, but mainly for the prostate on all levels, either for enlargement or cancer. Okay, here we have buffalo berry, Shepherdea canadensis. The berries of this plant contain a number of saponins, soap-like substances. In fact, another name for the plant is soapberry. Traditionally, native groups of this part of the world used to take the berries and put them into a buffalo horn and whip them up into a frenzy in a froth, kind of like a foam, which they call Indian ice cream. It actually has very unusual flavor, and today many people who do this as part of ceremony or just for a special event, they often add sugar to it to make it more palatable. But I did a talk many years ago at the university when I was an herbalist, say 25 years ago at the university where I teach. I gave a talk to a couple of hundred third, fourth year medical students and nurses, and talking about herbal medicine in general. And when I got to the buffalo berry, I was talking about the saponins and how they're used by the body internally, digestive-wise, to make hormones and things like that. And I noticed the professor in the corner was getting quite a bit more agitated as the talk went on. And so finally I finished my discussion and I said, well, are there any questions? And the professor stood up, and at the moment he says, Mr. Rogers. And of course you have to realize at the university that that's a fairly derogatory term, that you're not a professor and what do you know? Mr. Rogers, did you know that if you take saponins, put them into a syringe, inject them into the bloodstream, that they will destroy the red blood cells? And I paused just appropriately, and then I turned to him and I said, well, what idiot would do that? To which several hundred of the students in the room just guffawed and laughed, and that was the end of that. And the reality is, yeah, saponins, there's saponins in potatoes, for goodness sake. But that's not the most important part of this plant. This plant was used by native people as a tea. The flowering tips of this plant, and actually when you look at it, you can see on the back of the leaf, you can distinctly see these little brown spots among the silvery spots that give you a clue, a really good identification. This particular plant has been photographed in midwinter at minus 35 degrees Celsius, and the tips of this plant are growing at that temperature, which speaks a lot to the power and strength of this plant. They have a beautiful yellow green flower in the spring that they come out well before the snow is all gone. The tips of this contain different alkaloids like harmine, and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors. That is, an older class of antidepressants are MAO inhibitors for helping make sure that serotonin levels in the mind are in the brain are adequate for well-being. You can imagine the natives of this part of the world living at 30, 40 below zero in either teepee type structures on top of the ground, or even in basically a lot of the Woods Cree further north from here would basically dig holes in the dirt in the ground and then cover this with branches and planks. Living that way without food for several weeks, the hunger pains would set in, the depression could be extreme, and they would take the tips of these plants in the middle of winter, boil them, and drink the tea to help lift their spirit. Or as my friend Morris Kochansky often say, it's an endorphin inducer. But it's more than that. Early smoking mixtures would always include buffalo berry leaves in them, because as an MAO inhibitor, they would give a repetitive action to whatever herb they were combined with. And so smoking mixtures for arthritis were made more powerful. If it was for the mind, more powerful. If it was for cramping or lung problems, whatever the condition, by adding an MAO inhibitor, it helped promote the duration and intensity of the action. Further south from here, in Blackfoot country in southern Alberta, they actually had tobacco societies. And they would trade at a very, very considerable cost for seeds of tobacco. And then the tobacco society was charged with growing plants that only grew less than a foot tall, contained no nicotine, never went to flower, never went to seed. They would gather that particular plant that was also rich in harmaline, harmane, and harmine MAO inhibitors, and that was put in smoking mixtures combined with other herbs for either individual treatment or for collective consciousness of a group, smoking and passing the peace pipe, as we've seen in literature, to come to common consensus of community well-being. So the northern Cree had no access to the tobacco, so they used buffalo berry, and the southern used tobacco, and they both worked equally well for their purpose. So this is Indian pipe, also known as ghost pipe, Monotropa uniflora, a beautiful, eerily white kind of plant that was considered at one time to be a saprophyte. Recent evidence shows that is probably what is known as an epiparasite or a monoheterotroph, based on the fact that there seems to be a three-part connection between trees, fungi, and the Indian pipe itself. Ryan Drum has done some interesting research. He found that in early New England, when lands were cleared, forests were cleared, one of the first things that came in was Indian pipe, way before trees, way before fungi, into clearings, suggesting that there may be something associated with Indian pipe that sets the stage for further colonization by fungi and plants. It has been traditionally used by various native people throughout North America. The Cree used it for different conditions that were associated with fevers. It has been widely used for its very interesting connection with neuromuscular conditions, nervous irritability, restlessness, even some cases of epilepsy. It contains compounds that are not all known, but it appears to have a direct relationship with pain relief. That is, individuals who are suffering pain will be still aware that they have some pain, but it kind of removes them one step away from it. My herbal friend and colleague Sean Donahue has mentioned to me that he really likes to use Indian pipe for shifting or changing the sensory information pathways, and including for people who are experiencing bad trips from various types of drug overdoses or things of that nature. It makes sense because it appears that this herb removes people one step away from their experience, helping to put things more in perspective. I like to use the aerial parts. Some herbalists prefer the root, which really isn't necessary because that destroys the plant, and then you can get an annual harvest at the same sites, usually depending on the weather. One of the things that's very interesting about this, when you prepare it, it starts out white, you add the alcohol and water, and immediately turns a very beautiful aquamarine or almost a turquoise color that then quickly becomes very deep purple. Over time, a couple of weeks of tincturing this medicine, you'll note that the odor of a cocoa-like or chocolate-like kind of scent starts to permeate from the mixture. When taken in maybe a teaspoon to a tablespoon, Many people find that not only does it give them a restful sleep, but that also they have very vivid dreams, that the technicolor aspect of dreaming seems to come more forth. So, very interesting plant, Indian pipe.